racist to draw lines and divide people up by race. I mean, the definition of it would be we're going to divide ourselves up by race and say only a black congressman can represent black people. That is patently illegal
but the
under
issue
U.S.
is
law.
they were trying to
and
fix
it also
a problem.
And it also makes no sense when you consider that we're all Americans and we can vote for whoever we want. And often, according to the statistics, we do.
But the issue is here, the map that they were fixing put all of the black people in Florida in one district.
Exactly.
Right? That's not right either. You can't do that and say you have fair representation now. Yes, white people should vote for black people. Black people are going to vote for white people.
And they do.
Should. But you also shouldn't put all of one race in a whole state in one district and say we're going to allow you to operate here and we're going to operate outside of you everywhere else.
On CNN Newsnight, Dante Mills faces off with Scott Jennings as pressure rises over a major Supreme Court ruling on voting maps and minority representation, with Mills presenting solid facts while Jennings finds it hard to defend his stance. And as the exchange grows more intense, it turns into a sharp clash over race, fair representation, and the future of voting rights in America, building up to a moment where Mills strongly pushes back and shuts down Jennings' argument.
All right, joining us at the table, Dante Mills. He is in our fifth seat right now, and we're going to start with you. Give us some sense about what this ruling actually means.
Absolutely. Just so we have an understanding and a background, in Louisiana, it's 1/3% is black, African Americans. However, the way the lines were drawn in the previous map, only one of the 6 districts was represented by that 33%. That means the 33% African Americans only had 17% of the voting voice. So what they did is they redrew the map. The Supreme Court had to decide if you can use race-based redistricting to comply with the Voters' Rights Act. So can you use race-based redistricting if you're trying to fix a problem? The conservatives on the court said you can't. They said the law says you cannot use race when you are drawing lines, no matter who it's intended to help. The other people, on the other side, the liberal judges said, wait a minute, if there's a problem and you're trying to fix it, an exception should be created so that you can use race-based districting to fix the problem, because otherwise, how do you fix the problem? And that's where we are with that decision. The majority are conservatives who said, we're going to follow the law. The black letter law says you can't use race, no matter who you're trying to help. We're going to stick with that. Now we have a problem of what do you do when you have these people who are not represented appropriately in their states and in their districts.
And I have to tell you, I coming from Florida, I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, when African-American Carrie Meek, a Democrat, and Lincoln Diaz-Balart, a Republican Latino, Cuban-American, joined forces because there was no adequate representation for the Hispanics in South Florida or the African Americans in South Florida. And they joined forces and we got those districts. And today there's 3 Cuban Americans from South Florida, in part thanks to that decision and the fact that those 2 different parties and the partisans joined and banded together and fought for that equal representation.
Nir,
so be careful what you wish for, because they just might get it.
Because it worked there, what the majority, the judges on the majority decision said, those issues don't exist anymore, right? They said the problem is fixed. So we don't need these exceptions because these issues no longer exist in our society. Everybody should be equal now, and you can't use race to fix a problem, but that's just not the case. You still have underserved communities, underrepresented communities that you have to have some solution for.
Well, it's an interesting proposition you raised that they're not represented. My friend Patrick Ruffini sent out an interesting statistic tonight. There are 58 members of the House who are black. It's a record, actually. A majority are actually elected from plurality white districts. We're so racist in America. You've got white people electing African Americans to Congress in record.
What makes this stand out is how it exposes the gap between legal ideas and real-life outcomes. Because on paper, the idea that race should not be used when drawing district lines sounds fair. But in practice, history shows that so-called race-neutral maps have often produced uneven results. And after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, majority-minority districts became an important way to help black voters elect candidates they truly support, especially in states with a long history of voter suppression. And even though more black candidates are winning today, the issue is still not simple, since research and Supreme Court-related cases have shown that racial bloc voting still happens in many areas, particularly in parts of the South, which means that without carefully planned districts, the voting strength of minority groups can still be reduced, even when their population is large. And another key point is that representation is not just about numbers, but about how influence is shared. Because having 33% of the population but only one effective district does not reflect equal political power. And many political experts say that district lines can shape election outcomes more than campaign messages ever could. And history also shows through bipartisan efforts in places like Florida that fairer districts required intentional planning to fix imbalances rather than create them. So the real issue is not whether race should matter in theory, but whether ignoring it completely ends up preserving the same inequalities the law was meant to solve.
Numbers.
Are those people in
Inherently,
the South? They are not in the South.
Well, Tim Scott
Where
is. As far as I know, Tim Scott is.
That's one. That's one example. That's one example.
And so
That's not 58.
And so the issue is racism. It is inherently racist to draw lines and divide people up by race. I mean, the definition of it would be we're going to divide ourselves up by race and say only a black congressman can represent black people. That is patently illegal
But the
under
issue
U.S.
is
law.
they were trying to
and
fix
it also
a problem.
And it also makes no sense when you consider that we're all Americans and we can vote for whoever we want. And
I
often,
absolutely
according to
agree
the
with you.
statistics, we do.
But the issue is here, the map that they were fixing put all of the black people in Florida in one district.
Exactly.
Right? That's not right either. You can't do that and say you have fair representation now. Yes, white people should vote for black people. Black people are going to vote for white people.
And they do.
should. But you also shouldn't put all of one race in a whole state in one district and say we're going to operate. We're going to allow you to operate here, and we're going to operate outside of you everywhere else.
Interesting debating point. So your issue is with percentages and representation. So you're saying that you can't put all the people who effectively have the same political persuasion in one district. Let's take.
They may not.
Let's take.
They
Let's
may
take.
not.
All black
but-
people don't
They
think the
may
same.
not.
Well, but by voting historically, recently, they voted 80-90% Democrat. I think we can all acknwledge that.
No,
In
you should
New-
not.
in New
That is
England-
not an
in New-
assumption you
in-
should make.
Well, it's
You
a
just
statistic
literally
that I
said-
can read. So if you apply that logic to say, I don't know, New England, where 40% of the people in New England vote Republican and literally have 0 congressional districts.
Then you should support ending partisan gerrymandering.
The point is,
but you do not.
The point is, the court is trying to solve the issue of should we be dividing people up by race? Should we be saying only a certain race can represent a certain racial demographic? That is inherently racist to do. We've been doing it this way for decades. That's the racist piece.
No.
This is fixing it, in my opinion.
Just to be clear, this is a congressionally passed law. It's 60 years old. It's implementing a constitutional amendment, the Voting Rights Act. The problem that with your description here is that you are presuming that we do not still have instances where states will choose to basically eliminate the voice of black communities or Latino communities.
How is it eliminating it?
By lumping
By-
it all
by
together.
simply
Are they preventing them from
You have
voting?
one-
Yes, because
Well,
what they
they're all
do.
voting for the same-
Yeah, hold on.
they're all
Let me
voting
just
for the
say.
same- go ahead.
Let me just say, if you take a district and you basically say it was going to be 80% black district, and then you take that entire district and give 10% to everyone else, there's the voice of the black community is in a sense.
We're missing a point here.
witness.
We're
But
missing-
I
But
think
you're-
the
but you're
issue-
assuming they would all
but
vote.
the real
You just
issue here
argued
is
against
no,
it.
I'm not.
Scott, listen.
What really stands out in this exchange is how the argument treats progress as if it means the problem is solved, while the data shows a more complex reality. Because even though there are more black elected officials today, that does not mean representation is fairly spread. And research connected to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has long shown that without proper safeguards, district maps can still weaken minority voting strength, even when populations are large enough to have political impact. And another key point is how voting behavior actually plays out in real situations, as studies cited in cases reviewed by the Supreme Court of the United States continue to show that racially divided voting has not gone away, especially in certain regions, which means communities can still be split across districts in ways that reduce their overall influence, even if no one is directly stopped from voting. And representation is not just about casting a vote, but about whether that vote can truly affect outcomes. And there is also a misunderstanding that drawing districts with race in mind assumes people only vote based on identity, when in reality, the goal is to fix long-standing structural imbalances that have limited fair competition. And political experts have explained that tactics like packing and cracking, where groups are either clustered together or spread out, can heavily influence election results without changing a single vote. And history shows through examples in states like Florida that careful district design was often necessary to break through deeply rooted barriers. So the larger issue is not about dividing people, but about whether ignoring race completely ends up maintaining inequalities that still exist in modern electoral systems.
Florida, at one point was governed by a lot of good old boys who didn't want Cubans elected, who tried to dilute that vote, despite the fact that it was Republican. If it hadn't been for efforts like this, I remember times in Florida. I remember the signs in Florida: no blacks, no dogs,
and
no
when
Cubans.
Was that?
So you're just acting.
That was
That's a decision for
right. Hold on. No, it was it was in my lifetime. It was in my lifetime.
When? Was that yesterday or was that like 50 years ago?
40 years ago, 30 years ago.
Did you just decide?
And you think there's no racism?
I'm sorry, but Scott Jennings, you do not get to decide that racism is over today.
The people have.
No, they haven't.
No.
Okay,
The American people have decided.
Hold on a second.
The Congress
it is not true that the people have decided there is not racism. Let us please not say that, because that's just, it's incorrect. It is incorrect, Scott. It's not true.
But how is it?
As a member of the black community, I'm telling you,
she's arguing that Congress is somehow. Are you saying our congressional districts are inherently racist today?
No, I'm sorry. The Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress. It's up to Congress to determine whether it should be amended or not. It's not up to
the Supreme Court to decide whether it's legal.
I'm sorry, 6 Supreme Court justices who all dined with the president last night made this decision. And
you saying they had dinner and went and wrote it?
No, I'm saying that they're political actions. I'm saying that they are acting. I'm sorry. They look like they're acting in response to the political demands of the Republican Party. Because this has been a law.
So your view is they had dinner and then they went back to the court.
My view is that
hold on, guys.
I actually, can I just defend myself quickly here to say the following, which is I think a court that actually cared about the independence of the Supreme Court instead of politics would not have 6 people, all appointed by Republicans, go dine with the president yesterday. They do not care about how they look or independence.
For the last 30 years, the Supreme Court has said you can use race-based districting to fix a problem.
Yes.
This is the first time in this decision where they went against that and changed it and said, we're going to answer this question.
Hold on. We're going to pause here because we're way over time. We're going to pause.
What really stands out in this discussion is how easily progress gets mistaken for a finished solution, even though the reality is more complicated. Because decades after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, courts have still identified situations where minority voting strength was weakened through district boundaries, not by denying the right to vote, but by dividing communities across multiple districts in a way that reduces their combined influence. And that type of dilution is less visible, but still has a real effect. And there is also a tendency to think of racism as something that is either obvious everywhere or completely gone, when in practice, it often operates through systems. And research cited in Supreme Court of the United States decisions has shown that racially polarized voting still exists in several regions, meaning that without protections, certain groups can consistently lose political influence even when they vote in strong numbers. And representation is not only about how many people participate, but about whether their participation actually translates into power. And history also matters here, because places like Florida did not naturally evolve into fairer systems on their own, but changed through legal challenges, policy decisions, and adjustments to district maps aimed at correcting imbalance. And without those actions, many communities would have remained politically weakened despite population growth. So the main point is not about labeling everything in simple terms, but about recognizing that ignoring race completely in policy can sometimes end up preserving the same inequalities that earlier laws were designed to reduce, even in the present day.